led by a 56% expansion in hotels and restaurants. The goods producing industry, however, contracted by 2% as a result of a significant decline in mining. That decline was 62.5%. The operations of the central government over the April to July period generated a fiscal deficit of $0.3 billion, which is 98.7% better than the program deficit of $23.3 billion. Primary surplus amounted to $44.7 billion, which was $23.7 billion better than targeted, and this favorable performance was driven largely by the strong performance of tax revenue. Revenue and grants were ahead of budget by $21.7 billion, or 10.1%. This positive performance was driven mainly by tax revenue, which was $18.7 billion better than target and $42.2 billion above collections for the corresponding period of fiscal year 2021-22. The main contributor to the above program performance was international trade at $9.9 billion higher than budget. Income and profit taxes also performed well at $6.5 billion, and production and consumption taxes at $2.3 billion above the targets. Non-tax revenue at $15.5 billion also contributed positively to the surplus, with receipts exceeding budget by $3.3 billion. Capital revenue and grants, however, were lower than budget, with bauxite levy essentially in line with budget. Expenditure, net of amortization, totaled $236.4 billion, or 0.6% less than programmed. It comprised recurrent expenditure of $220 billion, capital expenditure of $16.4 billion. The recurrent expenditure was $0.6 billion below budget, reflecting lower than planned program spending and compensation of employees. Lower than planned program spending by 0.7%, compensation of employees lower by 0.8%. This was partially offset by above budget interest payments by 1.5%. Spending on capital programs was lower than programmed by $0.7 billion, or 4.3%. Amortization payments of $28.8 billion were below budget by $0.7 billion, or 2.5%, due to the lower than programmed value of external principal payments. The projected out-term and medium-term outlook. The medium-term fiscal profile presented in the interim fiscal policy paper reflects updated projections underpinned by the revised macroeconomic assumptions, which are nominal GDP growth, I'll just give for this fiscal year, is now forecast at 14%. The real GDP growth is now forecast at 4.1%, and the inflation is forecast at 6.8%. Oil prices are also now being forecast at $102.6. Central government, revenue and grants. The revenue and grants for fiscal year 2022-23 in the interim fiscal policy paper are projected at $780.5 billion, or 29.5% of GDP, representing an increase of $30.7 billion, or 4.1% over the approved budget. The tax revenue projection of $702.2 billion is what accounts for this increase. Over the 3-year period from 2023-24 to 2025-26, inflows from revenue and grants are projected to average 29.4% of GDP and grow at an annual average of 6.8%. This performance is expected to be underpinned mainly by tax revenue, with a projected annual average nominal growth of 7.4%. Expenditure, net of amortization, for the fiscal year is programmed at $30.8 billion, or 4% above the approved budget. The increase is reflected entirely on recurrent expenditure, comprising increases for recurrent programs, compensation of employees, and interest costs. Recurrent programs increased by $15 billion, compensation of employees by $5 billion, and interest costs by $10.8 billion. Expenditure, again, net of amortization, as a percentage of GDP is projected to fall from 29.2% for the current fiscal year to 28.3% in 25-26, mainly reflecting expected reductions in interest costs. Capital expenditure is projected to increase annually, averaging 3.1% of GDP over the medium term. Public debt expenditure for fiscal year 22-23 reflects a projected increase over the approved budget by 1.9% to $313.4 billion. This is equivalent to 11.8% of GDP, down from 12.8% in the previous fiscal year. The increase relative to approved budget is mainly attributable to an increase of $6.5 billion or 3.6% in domestic debt expenditure, which is marginally offset by a $0.5 billion reduction in external debt expenditure. The higher domestic debt servicing costs is mainly due to higher than anticipated interest rates. The 2022-23 debt service is comprised of amortization payments of $164.2 billion and interest payments of $149.2 billion. We have provided tables outlining the April through March 2022-23 as well as the medium term with the report. For self-financing public bodies, they continue to demonstrate recovery from the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, realizing an overall balance surplus of $16.7 billion for the April to June 2022 period. This represents an improvement of $13.3 billion relative to target. The main contributors to the overperformance were the National Insurance Fund by $4 billion, Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation by $2 billion, and Petrojam Limited by $1.7 billion. For 22-23, the self-financing public bodies are projected to achieve an overall balance of $11.7 billion, which remains in line with the original budget, and this is due to the potential negative performances from a number of entities countering the positive performances that we have seen to date. Excuse me. Other notable developments: public sector compensation restructure. Discussions regarding restructuring of the public sector compensation continue between the government of Jamaica and unions representing public sector workers. It is anticipated that these discussions will be concluded shortly, facilitating the implementation of a new compensation structure for the public sector. Recruitment with respect to the Fiscal Commission, our recruitment team was appointed to execute the process of interviewing and identifying Jamaica's first fiscal commissioner. The post was advertised in August 2022 and shortlisted candidates have been interviewed. A recommendation for appointment is expected in the near future. Disaster risk financing policy was approved by Cabinet for tabling in Parliament as a green paper, and this was expected to be done shortly. We are finalizing a communication strategy prior to that.
Thank you. As far as Dr. Henry.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and good morning, members and colleagues. The team from the PIOJ includes with me Mr. James Stewart, Senior Director of Economic Planning and Research Division. Mr. Hugh Morris is our Director of the Research and Modeling Unit, and Ms. Nyasha Garaway is the Director of our Macroeconomic and Trade Unit at the PIOJ. The Jamaican economy continues on its road to recovery, with the growth outlook for fiscal year 2022-23 remaining within the 3% to 5% band. Statin reported that the Jamaican economy expanded by 4.8% during the first quarter of the current fiscal year, that is April to June 2022. The outturn for April to June 2022 largely reflected the impact of the removal of measures implemented to manage the COVID-19 pandemic, compared with the corresponding quarter of 2021, when some of these measures were still in effect. Specific developments which contributed to the positive outturn for the quarter were increases in hectares reaped, which facilitated growth in the agriculture industry, increased employment and consumer confidence, which supported higher levels of domestic demand, and continued improvement in the markets of Jamaica's main trading partners that facilitated increased demand for industries such as transport, storage and communication, hotels and restaurants, which captures most of the tourism activities, and other services, which captures entertainment, sporting, and cultural activities. Despite the overall improvement, further growth was stymied by a decline in the construction industry and plant downtime in the mining and quarrying industry, mainly due to the closure of a refinery, which was affected by a fire in August 2021. For the projection for fiscal year 22-23, with respect to the short-term projection, the turbulence in the global economy resulted from higher inflation and supply chain disruptions, which were exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as a tightening in financial conditions, have led to several downward revisions by the International Monetary Fund, IMF. More recently, the fund further downgraded its projection of global growth to 3.2%, relative to 3.6% projected in April 2022. Turning to the domestic economy, for fiscal year 22-23, the expected performance is for growth within the range of 3% to 5%. This is predicated on continued recovery in the economies of Jamaica's main trading partners, albeit tempered relative to previous projections, resumption of production at one of Jamaica's alumina refineries, which resumed activities in July and is expected to ramp up production over the coming months, and continued improvement in the labour market as the economy recovers. The PIOJ's growth projections remain fluid, given the increased uncertainty in the global economy as a result of the war in Ukraine, which has compounded the risks to growth. These risks have begun to materialize in a global economy that is still recovering from the pandemic-induced recession, which skews the risks to growth downward. The main risks to growth for the short term are slower than anticipated recovery in the economies of Jamaica's main trading partners, which may temper the external demand for Jamaica's goods and services, adverse weather conditions, particularly from hydrological events. The recent heavy rains from Tropical Storm Ian have further highlighted Jamaica's vulnerability as a small island developing state. Also, stronger than expected slowdown in domestic demand as a result of tightening financial conditions, and lower than expected capacity utilization associated with factory downtime, partly as a result of aged equipment, especially in the mining and quarrying and manufacturing industries. And also continuation of supply shocks due to intensification of geopolitical tension, resulting in disruption of production activities. The potential upside to growth projections include faster than expected recovery in most industries following the removal of public health and social measures and safety measures, and increased demand associated with growth in domestic employment. Stronger than expected increase in capacity utilization in the mining and quarrying industry, and higher than expected external demand for Jamaica's goods and services, specifically tourism, due to, among other things, a faster than expected growth in the economies of Jamaica's main trading partners. Looking at the labour market, as at July 2022, since submitting the main report to the committee last week, Statin has released updated labour market data, which we will now share. Based on the labour force survey for July 2022, improvements were recorded in all labour force indicators relative to July 2021. And these include higher employment level, up 53,000 to 1,268,000 persons relative to July 2021. This continued the increasing trend of employment observed since the decline recorded in July 2020 due to COVID-19 and the public health and social measures implemented globally and domestically. However, employment remains below its pre-COVID-19 high that was at January 2020. Improvements were recorded for females, up 42,000 to 579,500 persons, and males up 11,000 to 688,500 persons. The lower unemployment rate down 1.9 percentage points to 6.6%. This reflected a reduction in unemployed persons by 22,800 and an increase in the labour force by 30,200 persons. Improvements were recorded for females, down 2.8 percentage points to 8.2%. Males, down 1.1 percentage points to 5.2%. And youth, as persons 14 to 24 years, down 7.2 percentage points to 16.7%. And based on the pace of recovery to date, Jamaica's employment level is on track to reach and surpass its pre-COVID-19 levels during fiscal year 2022-23, this fiscal year. This is, however, dependent on most of the downside risks to growth not materializing. Thank you very much.
Governor. Thank you, Dr. Governor.
Thank you, Chairman. This morning I have with me Dr. Wayne Robinson, the Senior Deputy Governor, Mr. Robert Stennett, Deputy Governor in charge of Economic Research and Planning, and Dr. Jide Lewis, who is in charge of Financial Institution Oversight. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine crisis have both had a negative impact on international commodities and shipping prices, and consequently on domestic inflation. Notwithstanding tighter monetary policy, the Jamaica economy is recovering, driven primarily by tourism. Employment is increasing and foreign reserves are strong. Also, the financial system remains sound. Bank of Jamaica is encouraged by the direction of the last 5 CPI reports, but we remain concerned that inflation is not yet solidly on a path downwards. Having peaked in April 2022 at 11.8%, inflation continued to broadly follow the expected track, falling to 10.9% in May and June, and then 10.2% in July and August. Since the preparation of this report, Statin reported that inflation at September was 9.3%, again in line with the bank's projections. The downward trend observed in inflation has been facilitated by 1. Decline in international commodity prices, both oil and grain prices. 2. Relative stability in the exchange rate. 3. Tighter Jamaica dollar liquidity management by the bank. And 4. Higher interest rates in the context of rising policy rates since October of 2021. Looking at the foreign exchange market, since the end of September 2021, which is the start of the bank's tighter monetary policy posture, the exchange rate has been less volatile. At the 20th of October 2022, the exchange rate depreciated on an annual average basis by 2.9%, well below the depreciation of 6.2% in the same period previous year. The rate at the 20th of October was actually appreciated from the $155 at the start of this calendar year. Bank of Jamaica conducted 27 flash sale operations over the year to the end of September, amounting to approximately $738 million and sold approximately $703.5 million to the energy sector, Petrojam and JPS. Notwithstanding these sales, net market purchases amounted to $786.6 million over this period. In the context of the stability in the exchange rate, there have been no major loss of competitiveness. At September 2022, on an annual average basis, Jamaica recorded a minor reduction in competitiveness of 0.6% relative to the same measure at September 2021. Jamaica's gross international reserves remain robust. At the end of September 2022, the bank's gross foreign assets amounted to US $4.3 billion, representing 126% of the measure that is considered adequate. The gross reserves were 485.5 million below the stock at the end of September last year. The decline mainly reflected Government of Jamaica debt service payments of $1.2 billion over the year. Jamaica's gross international reserves are more than adequate to sustain us going forward. The current account of the balance of payments is projected to be stable and sustainable. In particular, the bank estimates a current account deficit for financial year 22-23 of 1.8%, which, while projected to rise to 2.7% for the financial year 23-24, will moderate again in a range of 1 to 2% over the medium term. The reserves are therefore projected to remain adequate to pay the country's debt and to pay for imports of goods and services over the medium term. Against this backdrop, the bank has been tightening monetary policy by increasing the bank's policy rate by 600 basis points since the end of September last year, now stands at 6.5%. And secondly, by pursuing measures to contain Jamaican dollar liquidity expansion and maintain stability in the foreign exchange market. The bank expects that these measures will continue to 1. Cause interest rates on deposits and loans to rise further, 2. Make savings in Jamaican dollars more attractive relative to foreign currency assets and borrowing in Jamaican dollars more expensive. 3. In turn, these measures will help reduce the demand for foreign currency, leading to the continued stability in the exchange rate. Complementing the policy rate increases, the bank, while maintaining a flexible exchange rate system, has taken strong actions in the foreign exchange market between October of last year to date, including an adjustment to the net open position limit for deposit-taking institutions and, of course, selling foreign exchange to the market when necessary. The interest rate adjustments, in conjunction with the bank's decisive actions in the foreign exchange market over the period to date, have contributed to the maintenance of stability in the foreign exchange market. Without these actions, imported inflation and hence the final prices faced by Jamaican consumers would have been higher. To ensure that individual depositors are encouraged to continue to save in Jamaican dollars, Bank of Jamaica is also considering further measures to support upward movements in DTI's deposit rates. Based on the bank's latest assessment and absent any new shocks, inflation is expected to stabilize in subsequent months, consistent with a fall in commodity prices and the bank's overall monetary policy stance. Inflation is consequently projected to end financial year 22-23 at 6.8% and to close financial year 23-24 at 5.2%. Two key risks to inflation relate to monetary developments in the U.S. and domestic labor market pressures. On September 21 this year, the Fed raised its interest rate target by 75 basis points, which was 25 basis points more than what we had initially anticipated. The Fed also changed its forward guidance to signal that interest rates could rise to 4.4% by the end of 2022 and to 4.6% by the end of 2023, compared to its previous projections of 3.4% and 3.8% respectively. This more aggressive stance could result in a misalignment of domestic monetary conditions relative to those in the U.S., which could prompt a faster pace of exchange rate depreciation and consequently a derailment of the bank's inflation projections. It could also put more pressure on the reserves. It merits noting that another potential impact of these monetary policy decisions relates to the future prospects for the Jamaican economy as a whole. Should the monetary tightening by central banks globally lead to a recession, particularly in the U.S., the spillover effects on Jamaica could be felt in terms of visitor arrivals and remittances. Bank of Jamaica is therefore in the process of assessing this risk in greater detail. Labour market pressures also carry the potential for future wage adjustments to exceed those required for the consolidation of low, stable, and predictable inflation. Looking at the financial system, generally speaking, the system is sound. Deposit-taking institutions have adequate capital and liquidity to withstand the shocks. The quality of their loan portfolio has also remained fairly stable and well below the benchmark for concern. We, however, continue to closely monitor emerging risks from the macroeconomic environment, such as the fluctuation in bond prices and their potential impact on the system. Before closing, I just want to make a brief remark on Jamdex. One bank is now fully operational, that is National Commercial Bank, and another bank, JN Bank, entered the sandbox on the 1st of September 22 to test a mobile wallet that will facilitate the distribution of Jamdex. This bank, alongside a payment service provider, are both likely to come on stream with their wallets by the end of 2022. The major challenge to overcome is the technical issues which to date have influenced the low adoption of Jamdex by the other financial institutions. Based on the various stages of readiness of eligible wallet providers, the bank will be strongly encouraging the participation of all banks by the end of December 2023. Let me close, ladies and gentlemen, by reaffirming the Bank of Jamaica's dedication to achieving its primary mandate of preserving price stability. The bank will continue to closely monitor the data coming from the global and domestic economy and is prepared to act as is necessary to ensure a decidedly downward track for inflation. Our efforts are geared towards protecting all citizens of Jamaica. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much for the three presentations. I'll open the floor for questions by the members, those here present and online.
Sure. I just have a couple of questions. Let me start with the last one first. The BOJ. The CBDC participation, you indicated that only NCB is fully on board, and there are some technical issues that has impaired the coming on board of others, or perhaps the delay with NCB. What are those technical issues?
Well, generally speaking, for merchants to accept CBDC, especially large merchants. Small merchants are not a problem, they can use a phone. But large merchants who have POS machines and they have retail systems that tie back into their inventory, that has to be, the software of that has to be adjusted. And I think that I would claim responsibility for not assessing that this was going to be a challenge to overcome. Also, all the ATM machines have to be adjusted to be able to dispense CBDC and to exchange it for cash. So between the POSs and the ATMs, those are significant technical issues, even for NCB, but also for the other banks that have merchants with POSs as well as ATMs. So I would say fundamentally, those are the issues that are proven to be a challenge. There is some capital cost involved, but I don't believe that it is such that the banks would revile from adopting the currency.
The reason why I asked about the technical questions, Governor, is I don't sense or feel any excitement or any out there in the call it the transacting world, either on the part of consumers buying or merchants. You think that's sufficient efforts, promotion, what have you, has been done, and if not, what is being contemplated? Because you can have this, well, the advantages are clear, right? But if you don't have people coming on board, then whatever advantages that there may be would never be achieved. So it will remain a good idea that never manifests whatever inherent advantages there are.
You make a good point there. So the key to really rolling it out is to get the merchants on board. If all of us in here have CBDC, but there's nowhere for us to spend it,
correct,
that's a problem. So we have to get the merchants on board. The merchants are the customers of the banks. So we can't reach to those merchants. The banks have to reach to them. And as I said, there are issues involved in doing so, especially with the larger merchants. So for us to begin to really excite the consumer and get the consumer to accept CBDC, we have to be sure that sufficient of the merchant infrastructure is in place so that you can spend your CBDC there. And I would therefore say that we can't start our mass campaign until we feel that sufficient of that infrastructure is available. So that's probably...
But the question, which one comes first, the chicken or the egg?
No, it's clear to us. The merchants have to accept, be in a position to accept it for us to get the retailers to take it up.
I would want to think, and I might be wrong, Governor, that in contemplating the rollout of the CBDC, that some inquiry was made, surveys, want to call it, of the merchant community, in order to know what are the potential obstacles, and by extension, what can be done or ought to be done in order to make an initiative like this successful. In other words, what are the advantages for merchants, and to sell that to them, so to speak, for them to actually come on board. They are set in one way already in the currency through the banks. What is it to cause them? A merchant in my constituency in Portmore, right? Medium-sized merchant. What is it I could tell them or would convince them to want to come on board to this transition?
Well, it certainly will help them in their cash management to the extent that their purchasers use more and more CBDC rather than cash. It will help them with managing cash, reduce their costs. But we haven't detected any concern, disapproval, either amongst retailers or merchants about CBDC. And we have run pilots on NCB. Remember, there are 100,000 people out there already who have CBDC. They just don't have anywhere to spend it as they would like to. And in Christmas, we're going to be using 2 constituencies as pilots to spread CBDC again and to test the responsiveness of both individuals and merchants. So we don't detect from our surveys or our interactions with the market that there is any revulsion to it. It's just a matter of laying the foundation, then starting the campaign to educate people to use it. I remain optimistic about it.
Well, I have a strong interest in that success.
Well, with your backing,
yes,
I'm sure that we'll succeed.
Just additional question. Governor, for the Christmas rollout, the pilot project, have you already started the kind of discussions with those merchants? in the two constituencies that you.
Yes, as far as I understand, yes. One constituency is that of the Minister of Finance, and those discussions occurred either last week or the week before. The other constituency is the leader of the opposition, the spokesman for finance on the opposition side. And I believe those meetings happened yesterday. So some work has begun in those two pilot constituencies, and this is to distribute the Christmas money.
I would have thought, follow up to my colleague's question, that you probably would want a mix between urban and rural. Both constituencies you referred to are two strong urban constituencies.
Yes, and we were guided in part by NCB, and remember, they're really the ones on the ground. They have to go out there and load up all of the individuals, load up all of the contractors, load up all of the merchants. So we were very keen to be understanding of their restrictions.
Well, the question is, wouldn't that be a restriction? But in the report, you said it was only NCB that is fully operational now. So I don't think it could happen without them, because there's none of the other banks. But why the other banks are so reluctant to come on board? There are a few. There's, what, 7 commercial banks?
Yeah, I mean, when you speak to them, and in writing, they all have given us timetables. But we will be urging them to be fully on board by December of next year.
You're going to urge them?
Yes. We have our ways to urge.
You're optimistic that they will come on board?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I wish to share your optimism.
And as you say, it will address a lot of the problems that you identify a lot.
You can understand why I'm not as optimistic as you are. Yeah.
Member Hamilton?
Yes, Chair. Member Jackson pretty much asked a number of the questions I wanted in relation to the CBDC, and the governor just answered a question that I had in relation to a timeline within which the government would want to roll out fully the program, and he said by next year, December. Is that correct, Governor?
Yes, that is correct. That's BOJ's timeline, yes.
Which means that the government or the BOJ will be implementing some policies that can firmly encourage the banks to come on board. Or should I say aggressively encourage?
Yes, we will be encouraging them beyond what we have been doing so far.
I want to shift a little to the DTIs and the deposit rates, because you mentioned that you will be considering measures to improve the DTI's deposit rate. So what are some of these measures you're considering?
How the market should work is that when we raise our policy rate, depositors should get a better, higher rate, and lenders or borrowers pay a higher rate. Because the deposit base is not as responsive to rate movements and to moving between institutions that offer different rates, we find that depositors have not, by and large, got a better rate since we have started to increase the policy rate. So it speaks to the kind of lack of portability, the lack of understanding and knowledge of depositors that they can get a better rate and that they should move from one institution to another if they are not getting that better rate. It speaks to the difficulty in moving from one institution to another because of the KYC constraints, the need to provide all of the various documentation and the time it takes. So all those are part of the problem why depositors have not seen a significant movement in the rates that have been offered to them by the banks.
I've seen where some banks have sent out notices that they'll be increasing their lending rates. I don't know if it is for all banks, but I have.
Hold on 1 second, member. We're not hearing you on the inside. Hearing you here. So go ahead.
Are you hearing me any better now?
Much better. Thank you.
I was indicating that I noticed that there are some banks who have sent out notices that they'll be increasing their lending rates. I'm not sure if that's the same with our banks, but of note is that there is no similar notification on the deposit side to say that, we'll be increasing deposit rates. Is it that we allow the banks to determine how they go through, that process? Are they at liberty to determine whether or not they want to increase a deposit rate vis-a-vis a lending rate?
As it stands, yes, they are at liberty to do that. And I think not on the lending side, those rates, not everybody has been notified that their loan is going to be increased. Some may have, and maybe new loans have seen higher rates. But from the data that we get from the banks themselves, up to, is it June, Wayne? Up to July, we have not seen on a weighted average basis that lending rates have increased significantly at all. Deposit rates have moved very marginally, and most lending rates have not increased on average. But maybe new loans have seen higher rates. That's what the information that we have is.
Okay, Chair, can I ask the PIOJ a question in relation to the labor market? There is a report that we have 24,000 new net jobs that were created over the past 12 months, April 2021 to April 2022. And there is identification that these jobs have been in the real estate and other business services, information and communication, electricity, gas, and water supply. But is there a possibility for us to get a further disaggregation of this to better understand where the market is headed? Just to know whether or not we're going in the right direction, or if there is an interest in us in particular areas that we need to note for our local development.
All right, thank you very much, member. So starting to capture the data on the labor market in terms of the survey, as you've said, we've seen increases in employment, typically in the real estate, business services, renting, the BPO sector, in accommodations, which captures the hotels, some of the hotel and tourism activities, and in some other areas, we've seen that pick up in jobs. For further disaggregation, I think generally as it is now, that's where we are in terms of the breakout by sector. The trends would suggest we used to do some assessment of jobs of the future, where we posit in terms of where the demand will be for jobs, and we did that up to some years ago, just recently. And so we're looking at areas in the environment, in technology, in terms of artificial intelligence, robotics, some things that accord with some of the thrust now in terms of the emphasis on STEM and STEAM schools.
Right, the future of work.
Sorry?
The future of work.
Correct. And so we are seeing some policy direction that is sort of forward thinking in terms of trying to equip our young people, our student cohorts, our labor for jobs of the future in those areas. And we anticipate that continued emphasis for global demand as we see an aging population in some countries, many countries, Jamaica included, then we anticipate some pockets of demand in the labor market, particularly in the Africa region, where they're going to be demanding more workers from that region because they have seen the lowest, in terms of slowest paces of the demographic transition, where they are not aging as fast as other countries. And so in Europe and Asia, some of the countries there, you expect continued increase in demand for labor, the US and Canada. And so you would expect that you would find persons moving in terms of the mobility of labor, moving into those spaces. And as we position our people, we can continue to expect a high demand for our workers, commensurate with what you're seeing in terms of global demand.
You mentioned researching some years ago some of these emerging areas and skills. Are we seeing anything bearing fruit now, even if it's minute? Are we seeing anything locally?
In terms of, to note, you're saying, coming out of that? So
some of these emerging skills, the future of work area, are we seeing anything translating now?
Correct. And for some time now we've said the increased emphasis on technology, on science, and engineers. We've seen for some years now, even in the pickup in the mining and quarrying industry, we noted, we know ourselves, having spoken in this context in spoke about the shortage on engineers as we engage with persons in those sectors, in the mining and quarrying, particularly mechanical and chemical engineers. And so we've seen, remember that we've seen some of those coming out of the assessments at that time and continuing, and with the issue of the future of work. So it has told us that we anticipate a continued and, really increasing demand in the areas of technology, engineering, and importance of mathematics and science. We are seeing an emphasis on trying to do more in terms of application of science, in terms of to impact the day-to-day. I spoke with the chairman of the SRC just in conversation yesterday, and he spoke of their own thrust to improve impact in terms of the practical day-to-day application of science in the various ways in the Jamaican economy to impact lives, productivity, etc. So we are seeing some of those coming out. We've also seen, in terms of comparative advantage for the country, among other things, our culture and what we call the orange industry, the orange economy, where we are seeing that Jamaica has a comparative advantage, along with the destination itself as tourism, but then and the people in terms of our culture and for music, film, gastronomy, the foods, so we're seeing that increased emphasis. And again, you've heard the Prime Minister speaking of the need to infuse greater application of the arts, even among the emphasis on STEM. So we speak of STEAM schools and initiatives to include that also. So those are some of the things we've been seeing.
One other follow-up question in relation to capturing this data. So you mentioned the AIs and the technology-based employment that is coming on stream. Are we in a position to be able to fully capture these jobs when they actually come on stream? Because I know we kind of have a rubric that we follow all the time. So I'm not sure if we're ready for it.
Right. Thank you, Member. We'd have to look more at the numbers. So part of the initiative, so education is, as you know, education and training, one of the greatest areas that promise significant returns on that investment, on human capital investment. Tremendous returns, but again, a characteristic is that it typically takes time. And so the throughput, people, there is always benefit as we speak to the return on input to early childhood education and the increased gains there. But again, based on that age cohort, it would take some time. So I'd have to do an assessment to see, having been emphasizing that over the years, where are we now in terms of the readiness you speak to. I think it's important that the initiatives are underway, and a lot would probably need to be ramped up in terms of, as we speak of quantum, but then we'd have to come back to you in terms of specifics. But I think for those areas I've mentioned, we are seeing some initiatives underway to treat with having identified those trends and the anticipated demand.
But what I want to just underscore is not just the readiness, but the capturing of the data. Because we do have persons now who are engaged in some of these new and emerging skills, but I'm not sure if they're being captured locally.
Okay.
That's the issue I have.
Yeah, we'd have to get back in terms of this engagement with Statin ourselves just to speak to that. But that's a good point that we would. Data generally is a challenge globally in many spheres, and while we do relatively better than many in terms of particularly in small island developing states where there are various constraints, capacity otherwise, we do well in some areas of data collection and our best practice in some other areas of data. Data still generally is a challenge against the backdrop of a significant degree of informality, where a lot is happening, but sometimes not on the radar.
We just don't know.
And so we are mindful of those. But there has been, I think, coming out, increased emphasis coming out of the pandemic, the COVID-19, the emphasis on data, especially as globally we've been focusing on assessing a sort of situation analysis on our various development trajectories. How are we doing with relation to SDG implementation? How far are we as we get closer to 2030? So with that global emphasis, the issue has come up about how can we access better and more reliable and robust data. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is enough. I will allow somebody else to go and then come back.
You would like to go again, though?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Member Jackson, and then...
I really want to follow up on some questions by colleague, Member Hamilton. But I start with you. The question of the data that she asked about, I'll be interested in that. But when I listen to you, Dr. Henry, about these future jobs, I remember so many years ago when we had a burst in the ICT sector, and the complaint was about the low salary levels, the call centers, and then there was a thrust to then train people in the area where you use technology to create, the more creative side of it. And the argument then was that we need to have a critical mass of persons skilled in those areas to attract investors into Jamaica to utilize those skills. And I happen to have attended one training facility in Montego Bay at the time that trained some. I don't remember the exact area, but it's in that eye level. Regrettably, with that thrust of training, both in Montego Bay and in Kingston, that cohort of persons who were trained, there was no investment to utilize those trained skills. And all of those persons who were trained drift out into other areas other than those specialized skill areas that they were trained in. I mentioned that to say that as we look for these future jobs in these specialized training areas, what level of coordination is being done and by whom to ensure that who we are training, they have take-up for them? Is it within the local space or is it external? And as it relates to external, there is a vast shortage of labor in Canada, in the UK, in the US. But because of their domestic policy position regarding recruitment of persons, say for example in the hospitality industry in the US, one person I spoke to just yesterday in Iowa was telling me if they can have some arrangement between now and the end of the year, they can take 1,000 persons, truck drivers, you name it. But the restrictiveness on that side doesn't make it possible for them to go. So my question is, while we anticipate or we're seeing this demand for more labor, for the external side, what is being done to facilitate that? Is there any active engagement with our Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Foreign Affairs to utilize those external opportunities there? When the training and so forth take place locally, where will they be absorbed? Because it's one thing to have these numbers that show in this big growth. But then again, it's not manifests itself in employment for these persons. So if you give me a sense of how the data being collected and by extension the planning, because if there is no planning being done, then all of that which we create won't give you the end result which you want, which is business activity, employment, and all of that, that can give you the projected changes from these activities that you mentioned of. So that is an area I would want. But after my colleague come back, I'll go back to another point that the governor made regarding the interest rate and the whole question of portability.
So thank you very much, member, for the question and a very useful set of questions. So it's a complex, let me say multifaceted, because people get concerned when they say complex, right? But it's a multifaceted issue because there are many aspects. So to answer your question, yes, there are initiatives underway in recognition of those trends and anticipated increased demand in the areas as you've spoken. So we know that as we've seen the build out in the BPO sector and concerns raised as to the quality and levels of jobs and the need to upskill. And so we've seen specific initiatives with the help of also some of our development partners. We've seen those initiatives, as you mentioned, also underway. We have, since 2017, a migration and development policy that speaks to and recognizes your sort of mobility of labor and a circulation in terms of brain circulation, that understanding and underpinning that people will be free to come and go. And in that context of the free mobility of labor, then it has its own challenges, even though some benefit in some context. You are correct. So but on the destination countries, correct. So we've seen discussions through the Ministry of Labor, their own engagements. We've seen the Ministry of Health and Wellness, where they've seen in recognition of the demand for nurses in health and wellness and MOUs being signed with some of these destination countries to help to build a pool and ensure smooth transitions. We've seen the Ministry of Education being engaged. My suggestion, member, because it's such an important issue, it would warrant that sort of a discussion where we have those colleagues, and we'll be happy to attend also because of our own engagement in the process, to speak broadly to these issues, just to ventilate coordination, to ventilate some of the strategic thinking around training, who is the take-up, what's the thinking around the mobility of labor, what are the challenges. We know there's a mission in Canada around some of those issues to identify. But I think it's worth a sort of deep dive with policymakers just to sit down and have that discussion.
Member Hamilton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm heading now, I think it was the BOJ report that spoke to the self-financing public bodies. It was reported that there's an overall increase in revenues of about $42+ billion, an overall net operating balance of more than $13 billion for some public bodies. But there were mixed financial results by some of these PBs, as there was a report of a number of these public bodies that are in arrears. So mention was made of the NWC, HAJ, JUTC, National Health Fund, NROC, etc. What kind of assistance, or is there any kind of policy directive that is being implemented to assist these bodies in coming out of the red, to be clear? What is being done to help them? Because they will obviously put a significant strain on the coffers, and they can't continue to run into arrears. So I would love to know what is being done to assist them and to prevent them from continuing in this kind of a trajectory.
All right. So I think that's directed at me. So yes, we have a number of public bodies that are not performing as we would like. There is not, however, overall policy that would immediately deal with those public bodies. What we do have is the rationalization program that has been ongoing in terms of identifying public bodies that may need to be addressed, whether in terms of merging with the parent ministry, whether a number of public bodies need to be merged or closed, and that operation continues. We have addressed a number, but it continues. In terms of the ones you named, so like the JUTC, we would have been having an ongoing issue in terms of its ability to be a self-financing public body, and therefore the government of Jamaica has in fact been assisting the JUTC across the years. There is generally a provision within the central government's budget for the JUTC. We are currently, along with others, we are currently looking at their operations. Ministry of Finance works with them to ensure that the priority objectives that they need to address they are able to do that, and so we would be looking at them now. We would be doing an assessment going into the first supplementary budget in terms of what may be necessary.
But for example, JUTC has not been profitable in a number of years. So at what point are we going to say this is unsustainable? Or at what point are we really going to intervene in a meaningful way to try to stem the arrears? And I know it has to do with operations.
No, but I'm not in total agreement with you that it has to do with operation. And in many of the instances, in some of the entities that the members speak about, has to do with government policy also. Because in the case of the JUTC, if there are no buses, then they won't have any increase in its fare box. You could subsidize them from now until, if it is that the government policy is not to replace the old rolling stock, then you're going to see a continued downward spiral of the entity. And I would imagine that government policy has some say in some of these entities in how it is that they recover or they do not recover.
Right, so yes, there would be some policy decisions that are needed. With respect to the JUTC again, certainly we have made a provision for additional buses to be purchased, but there are some policy decisions that I guess will be looked at in the near future.
And what of the NWC?
On the
Public utility, we can't do without it.
Right, so on the NWC, again, we have been assisting and looking at its operations. We recently, in the last fiscal year, provided a significant amount, approximately $1 billion, to address sale loan payment that had become due. We have also continued to assist the NWC to ensure that that critical operation continues, and we are working with them to improve the operations to move in the future to a self-financing public body. Again, potential policy decisions required.
FS, the JUTC situation is not a new one. It's been bad for a while and getting worse every year. It's bad in terms of its revenue depletion and bad in terms of its continuing reduction in service. And as the chairman said, their revenue side can't improve if they don't have fare boxes to collect the money in. as I said, it has been for a while. You said a moment ago you're working with them to ensure that their situation is in a satisfactory way. You're working with them. Has it been helping?
Right, so at a technical level, we're working with them to ensure that the service that they need to provide continues. Again, there are some policy decisions that are required, but I believe those will also be coming in the near future.
The reason I ask that, FS, is that there is an exigency on the user, and I can tell you, in my constituency in Portmore, if you come in Portmore in the mornings and you see what the roads look like with passengers can't get bus, this is not data I'm talking about. This is real life reality for persons on the ground, and Portmore is not an exception. But I can speak to it. I get the complaint. It's miserable. It's terrible. Not only the loss in productivity that, you know, the governor and the PIOJ, they report what happens. It is what they fail to do will give them bad report. Because they don't grow the economy, you know, with all due respect, Dr. Henry and Governor. They don't, well, the governor, yes, governor involved with policy, monetary policy on the one side. But in terms of productivity, production, right? It is the JUTC's a catalyst in all of this. Not to mention this, the social misery factor that is imposed on the commuters for what they have to, what they are subjected to out there. Saying all of that to say, FS, this is not one that can be studied indefinitely. This is one that needs surgical operation to save the public and to save the economy from further decline, because the productivity is impaired by the inability of our workers to go to work. So I'm not comfortable, FS, in your response that you are working with them. You have to perform some urgent surgery. You have stewardship over the finances of these entities.
Okay, sir. So as already indicated, we know that part of the problem is the number of buses, and that is being addressed. It takes time for the buses to be produced, but manufactured, but it's coming. We have moved on that front. Certainly, we have been coming out of, still recovering from the pandemic in terms of something like addressing the fare structure. I believe that will come in the near future, but you had to look at whether you do that at a period where persons would have been impacted by the pandemic. And certainly by what's currently happening, but that I suspect is also coming, along with some other policy measures that will seek to address the situation.
I'm a little different with my colleague in trying to put it at your desk, because in my response, I come back again to policy decisions which are to that of the government. You're a technocrat. No disrespect. But if it is the policy of the government not to purchase buses, you as FS can't go ahead and say you're going to go purchase buses. So it comes right back again, member and colleagues, back to the policy of the government. And I keep reminding, I made a suggestion here at a similar meeting, just similar to how the Jamaica has been now put at the Ministry of Finance, or oversight from the Minister of Finance, that the entity, the JUTC, which is critical, not only just the movement of people, but to productivity. Transportation overall is a big contributor to our economy. And and I have to say that we have not really put that investment or thought in transportation as we should. Yes, we're purchasing 50 buses, but the JUTC is rolling out only half of what is required for it to be somewhat viable. When you bring these 50 buses, you need to retire 50 of what you have left that has wheels on them. So we're not really, we're far behind, and my fear, Madam FS, is that when we decide to rebuild back the JUTC, the cost to the taxpayer, which has already borne a huge burden to the taxpayer, we're subsidizing it by $5 billion on top of a $3 or $4 billion loss over the last few years. That's money that the member from East Rural could have taken some people off of the Gully Bank with that. Yeah? And for me, the longer we take, is the worse the situation is going to be. But again, it comes right back down to the lack of policy from the government itself in taking the JUTC as an interest. I've stopped blaming, and I'm not saying that there's no blame for the staff at the JUTC, but if you give them basket to carry water, then that's all they can carry. Yeah? So it comes back down to the policy member of the government, which has not been in favor of the JUTC at this time. And there are other entities like that. I mean, I know that the NWC has been hampered by trade, that they can't get the pipes, that we have projects sitting down for a long time. But we have to start thinking forward and thinking in a way that we take these things into consideration. We put the money in the budget, but then we can't do the work.
Chair,
go ahead, Member.
I will agree with you in some respects where policy is required. Definitely agree with that. Yes, we need more buses. But if the JUTC is not operating optimally, or there's improper management, because I remember the JUTC coming before us, and them not having a dollar figures to the theft of fuel, which impacts their bottom line. We speak of NWC. They have the non-revenue water is a huge issue, but that has to be tackled, and that is an operational issue. So yes, they can get the pipes, but if you don't address the issues within the organization, then we'll always have this problem, regardless of what policy is.
Member Holness. Yeah.
Chair, through the FS, I wanted to have an appreciation in terms of your discourse with the various ministries. If in any way from the Ministry of Finance, you're able to do an assessment as to what it takes to run the entity efficiently, how many buses, what sort of fare structure would be required, so that the populace also have an appreciation that if I need to pay $200 on a taxi from Portmore to Kingston, I can't pay $50 on the bus from Portmore to Kingston, because it is just not efficient. Do we actually do that type of exercise? In my own constituency, I have to be at pains to explain to persons that if we do not pay for water, there is nowhere for the money to come from to provide us the pipes and to take the water to us and to make sure that it is treated and that we get water consistently. And persons are appreciating and buying into exactly that, saying, look, we really want to pay for our light. We really want to pay for our water. Yes, we know it's rural. We know it's expensive to get it here, but communicate with us as to what it really requires. If people have no appreciation for what their contribution should be, we'll never get it. So do you have any ability with your discourse with them during the budgets to be able to say, yes, this is where we are. We're at $50. This is where we really needed to be at $200. And until we're able to get there, this is what we will need to supplement. We will continue to have this loss. We will continue to have to find the money for this loss. But it is not necessarily inefficiency or dissect like JPS does with their loss calculation. this is inefficiency and loss because of inefficiency, and this is loss because it is a social good, a social service that the government is providing, and we cannot charge the full cost for those services.
Okay, so yes, we have discussions with the entities, sometimes with the parent ministries. As you are aware, there is a public bodies budget, and therefore the Ministry of Finance, through its Public Enterprises Division arm, does interface directly with the entities and their parent ministries. In the case of a JUTC, yes, we would get information that indicates what they require. Again, as you are aware, though, there are numerous requirements across the public sector, and therefore, again, at the policy level, a decision has to be taken as to what is addressed.
FS, following on from that question, are we at least able to dissect where our major losses are, where our major inefficiencies in terms of productivity is, so that we can say, guess what? First thing we have to tackle is JUTC. Let's spend a year, 2 years, 3 years and resolve our public transportation issues, the costs, the inefficiencies in the system. And then we need to move on to water, or we need to move on to providing electricity, whatever the case is. Are we able to determine where our priorities really need to be? What do we need to tackle first?
Okay, so for the Ministry of Finance, we would need to work with a number of other ministries in terms of being able to establish exactly where those priorities are. Mm-hmm.
You know, this JUTC one is a bit. The chairman made the point about the revenue side of JUTC. I recall right here in this house, you know, when you're here a while in this house, you hear the stories them sometimes coming full circle. At one point, JUTC reported that their revenues were constrained by the competition and the key routes with taxes. And during that period, there was a vigilant effort made to police these routes and to keep the illegal taxes and so forth in order to preserve the revenue stream for the JUTC. And then after that, we saw an outburst, and the minister in charge of transportation, a whole lot of licenses are going to be issued, which seems to go in contravention of what they want to protect the revenue side of JUTC. So we have all of these things just happening. Is there any coordination as to what really is required for JUTC and the public transportation sector, and plan accordingly? It seems so hodgepodge and piecemeal, and you do this over here, so do that over there, and at the end the whole thing is crumbling. In fact, it has crumbled. It has already crumbled, because what we have here now cannot pass for any civilized, modern, urban transport operation. It has crumbled. What you probably have to try to do, Ms. James is here from the Public Enterprise Division. When I was certain place at some other time, your unit would make the recommendations as to what enterprise need to close, need to be what have you. And I know, Ms. James, you do that more pointed and piercing than your FS did, because I used to have those discussions with your unit when I used to be elsewhere. Is that the verdict with JUTC? Because you never used to take so long, you know, with these enterprises. You make your recommendations soon when you see the decline is rapid.
I'll have to protect her from answering you, member.
Right.
As that would not be in her purview, but she can make the recommendation. But I'll have to protect her on that one.
No, Ms. James is a very competent and experienced public officer. I can vouch for that.
Member Jackson, and I think there's a greater issue, Madam FS, and as I said earlier, I made a recommendation that there has to be a different approach to the JUTC. And if it is that the Ministry of Transport itself, I mean, you have the PIOJ, you have more revenue coming in now. What is the plan? And I think the country needs to hear something on what is the plan. You can't take 2 hours to board a bus from Portmore to come into Kingston to work. By the time you get to work, you're non-productive. Right? And I think that there needs to be some interest, because it is the Ministry of Finance that is spending this money on behalf of the taxpayers. We had the MD for JUTC here who said that if he did not get any additional resources in the supplementary to buy petrol, he would be out of petrol by November. You know, so those are the things that we're talking about. And when it is that we're subsidizing the bus fares here, and a child in my constituency that have to leave Balaclava to go to Manchester High School is paying 2 or 3 times the fare. You know, there's this, we have to take a greater look at the entity itself, otherwise it will continue pulling down. We used to have 2,000 Hackney carriage license operators in the KMTR. You have over 5,000 now. And there's no way you're going to get them off of those JUTC routes. And the reason why we have been so relaxing in keeping them off of the route is because the JUTC is not living up to the license that it has in providing the amount of seats. So it's not good enough for us to keep coming here time after time saying it is something that we're looking at, when we see that every budget we are giving more and more and more to the entity from taxpayers' resources, and they are not getting back the service that it ought to get. So I'm just begging that we look at it in a different way, approached in a different way than we have been doing over the decades.
Noted.
Yeah. Back on the same JUTC? Okay. Go ahead.
Member Hamilton had asked a question regarding the deposits, and you had been commented about the portability issue with accounts, which seemingly hinders or impede or impair persons taking advantage of those. When I heard you mention about the KYC factor, you and I have had this discussion here about those KYC accounts generally. Governor, it is difficult to have confidence in the banking system. I'll tell you why. I remember in this house, when I tabled the amendment, and I met with all the CEOs of the banks in that room over there in the conference room, one of the complaints that they made, they made, was the difficulty in portability, and they want that to be accelerated so that the accounts, people can move across accounts. In fact, I offered to lobby for them, the government. Of course, I never get no formal request thereafter for the lobbying for greater movement across. And why challenge my mind, Governor? I've heard you said here in a previous committee meeting that the reason why you can't have any standardized KYC to allow for greater portability is because different banks have different requirements in respect to their customers, etc. You remember that discussion? That when you were sitting in the middle here, I think it's a standing finance committee meeting. So the problem I'm having, they complain then that they want that to happen. And then I hear you saying it can't happen because of the varying standards that they have. Can't they amongst themselves agree on some minimum clutch of information that will satisfy across the thing? You can have different categories, of course. You know, people like me will have lower requirement as against my colleague, Ms. Olness, that would have a more stringent one because of deposit amounts, you know. But even if you have tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Not even just, they hear of it? Not even just.
Well, I was only use it for illustration.
Speak to the issue.
Governor, it was only for the purpose of illustration.
I don't like to
right?
perpetuate lies from the PNP at all.
I am only using that to illustrate variance. Okay, well, people use some what they choose, and I won't go down that road. But you see the point I'm trying to make, Governor.
Yeah, so member, it's not...
They are the ones who made that request.
Yeah.
And so it was a bit difficult to hear you saying that they can't agree amongst them. It's 7 banks we have in Jamaica, you know?
No, more than that.
I mean, deposit, how much commercial banks we have?
Probably 11 DTIs.
Okay. When even we just use with even 7, the major ones, we can call them out. They do know them.
Yeah.
But why is it that we can't get somewhere?
So remember, it's not a matter that they have different standards. Everybody's supposed to have the same standard. It is a matter, however, that each DTI wants to verify the information themselves. They don't want to accept that this bank over here accepts your information, so I will accept it. Unless it turns out that the person is a money launderer and their correspondent bank says, not doing any more business with you because you are encouraging or you have customers that are money launderers. So every financial institution wants to do their own due diligence, but the standard of due diligence is pretty much the same right across. What we want to achieve with the assistance of NIDS is that we have a central depository of KYC information that, say, the Bank of Jamaica would hold, and each bank would accept that depository information as gospel, so to speak, and therefore allow you to be able to move your account from one institution to another, or to have several accounts at different institutions.
So you're saying that, that with the NIDS provision, you'll be able to do that?
But NIDS would help a lot, because what NIDS will do is establish that the person in front of me, verified by the government, is Dr. Wade Robinson and not anyone else.
And being able to do that, will it translate in having the greater levels of portability?
Well, it will certainly make the KYC process easier, and in so doing allow us to build that central depository.
Yes, Governor, I hear you. But being able to do all of that must be a means to an end. The end I'm looking at is greater portability.
Absolutely.
Is it then, can I conclude from what you have said, that once you have that bit of information through NIDS, as you said, become gospel, will that then make for greater portability?
Well, we have to have more than just NIDS. We have to have the compliance and acceptability of all of the DTIs, that the information that we will build and how we keep it securely is acceptable to them. And then we will have portability.
But remember, I want to just come in here, because as the governor said, it's down to the banks of what they accept. So having NIDS don't mean that they're going to accept it as a central repository for the information and portability of.
No, but I think that the banks are open to...
No, and the reason why I'm coming to this point, I mean, no matter how long the member might be banking at an institution and want to open up an additional account, just the requirement itself of knowing the customer for years, for decades, and especially for us as parliamentarians being politically exposed. To get my daughter to open an account recently was 6 weeks. And I've been banking at the bank for decades.
That's short.
You know, and even to try and open up an additional account at the same bank. It is not giving me hope that when you have needs that it is even going to be any easier, because they are running their own know your customer section compared to what may be governed by the Bank of Jamaica. And we have been talking about this portability for a very long time if we're going to drive competition in the market.
I knew there was a reason why I asked Dr. Lewis to come with me, member. So can I ask him to speak to that? He's a deputy supervisor. He is intimately involved with all of the DTIs.
Okay, so let's just make some clarifications. The law for the Proceeds of Crime Act, the regulations have been amended in 2019, and it's a big structural change. What it really allows is for banks to recognize different tiers of risks for their customers. Before, the law only had average risk and high risk, and so there was just two big buckets. The law now allows banks to recognize low-risk customers, medium-risk customers, and high-risk customers. Unfortunately, Chairman, you don't fit in the low-risk customer because of how poker is designed. But what it really allows is for once a bank identifies somebody as low-risk, we have actually written to the banks and indicated that they don't need to require references for that customer. They only need to understand how much that customer intends to spend or use in their account on a monthly basis. And once it conforms to their internal risk management guidelines, then the requirements are a lot less. However, as the risk profile of that customer changes, they would come under an obligation to get more information. So let us say somebody joined a bank and started depositing $20,000 a week. And then a year later, they start to deposit $200,000. And then a year later after that, they start to deposit $300,000. The expectation of that institution, financial institution, is that they now need to collect more information to understand the source of those funds. And so, for example, they may require a job letter, they may require proof of income, they may require source of wealth information. So it is now a very dynamic process compared to what it was a few years ago.
Dr. Lewis, with your permission, my recollection, I was on the Joint Select Committee, when the poker legislation was being promulgated. And if my recollection is correct, yes, the banks must know their customer. And when they see suspicious transaction, they have an obligation to alert the authorities. Because you know your customer, use the examples you gave of a $20,000 per week deposit, and then it changed to $200,000, and you see, probably you won't jump the thing at the first $200,000. But when you see a pattern that establishes a great disparity, they have an obligation, the banks, to alert the FID or which other investigative authority to find out and establish what is happening with this person. Can become a suspect now for money laundering or
unless the
terrorist
person,
financing.
Yeah, unless the person demonstrates that, yes, they have been promoted, for example, or they grew their business and they can demonstrate that in fact. Because you must evolve through your lifetime. No, so you're not going to be stuck in one place, hopefully.
But the issue, though, Dr. Lewis, is that customer business operation will come to a halt unilaterally by the bank because of this unusual situation, right? So business can become impaired. So the business person will be affected, not so much with a private individual. But the point we're raising is, isn't there a normal trigger where the investigation takes place and the FID come knocking on your door?
You have a reporting responsibility.
Yes.
So it's a dynamic process, because remember, banks are banking a wide cross-section of the economy, and you're expecting that for each sector they're going to have different characteristics. So the know your customer obligation is about understanding who is in front of you. First, that they are who they say they are, which is the governor's point around needs, being that mechanism where rather than reading 3 references and a pastor's letter, you can now have an agency, NERA, that is going to authenticate the person's bona fides in terms of their identity. So that's one part. But then the other part of is, what is your source of income? What is your source of wealth? And I'm saying for low-risk customers, they no longer have that burden to prove that kind of information. But as their risk profile changes, the banks will have an obligation to get the additional information to satisfy themselves that they understand not just who the person is, but that their behavior comports with their economic reality.
And to not throw hot water on the issue, that information has to be renewed. So you may do it today and 5 years later. In fact, just yesterday, my bank called me and said they want all these things from me again.
Politicians, high risk, politically exposed persons. Well, I'm just curious, what makes...
Well, you know, remember, I blame ourselves too, you know. We are the ones who pass it into law. We are the ones who pass it into law. And you know, we put the noose around our own necks, and we're calling ourselves criminals before everything else. We are the ones who passed in the law. I can't even ask Dr. Lewis to even answer that. We are the ones who passed the poker law inside here. But believe me, I mean, it frustrates our own family too, because we are not the only ones, but every member of the family. My 17-year-old daughter, and she asked me why it took so long to open a bank account for her, and I said because of this frustration. Couldn't take her 6 weeks. She worked over the summer and had to sit down on a check for 6 weeks because she couldn't open a bank account.
But Chairman, if I may though, and Governor, I know this precedes your tenure and also that of Dr. Lewis. When the poker issue came up and the profile of political persons, is it the what's the group by the name Factor?
FATF.
Yes. It is their stipulation that classify politicians as politically come with that designation, because my recollection is correct. The BOJ, who led the legislation, claimed that it was international convention that requires this.
Yeah, so internationally, the convention is that politically exposed persons are automatically designated as high risk. So it is consistent with not just what happens in this jurisdiction, but in jurisdictions globally. So there would be no departure from international standards in that respect.
I would thought that where politically exposed persons would be more endangered, because you can become poorer by being politically exposed, and they have no lower risk. With, of course, there are exceptions. But so, in other words, why I pose that about the if that is to change, what would can it be changed? Let's go beyond the talking here.
The obligation and the situation that Jamaica finds itself in, being on the FATF grey list, means that we increasingly have to comply with international standards where anti-money laundering and terrorism financing requirements are concerned. It could be deemed as a weakening of our regime if internationally all our partners agree that this particular category of PEPs is high risk, but Jamaica decides unilaterally that it's going to treat with it differently. So there's certainly, we are a sovereign nation and we can make or independent decisions, but we have to understand that it travels with implications because we exist in a global environment, and there are going to be implications associated with that. So that's how I would respond to the query.
So you feel if some politicians get locked up for corruption or criminality, it will help to reduce our designation? Just curious.
I'll put it the other way. I think it will be on the burden of Jamaica to demonstrate that this particular category of persons is somehow different from that which exists globally. So the burden would be on us as a jurisdiction to demonstrate that, and the question is, can we, and how would we do that?
You think we can do it? You think we can do it?
I'm not in a position to respond to that.
I just want to go back to the PIOJ's.
Just one thing before you go back to
Sure.
PIOJ. FS, on my WhatsApp, somehow it is lighting up. Persons are indicating that a significant portion of the revenues for JUTC still come from the cash system because the same bus drivers argue, for whatever means they need to, that the boxes do not work, which forces back a cash collection system.
That's true.
And some indicated that the last shift every night is the driver's shift. And it needs to be said publicly that a big part of the revenue loss, a big part of why we cannot replace our buses, a big part of why we will need to be able to collect more fares, is that we must force ourselves, commuters, the drivers, the inspectors on the bus, the persons who would normally deal with ticketing, to go to an absolutely 100% cashless system so that we can stem the flow of revenue theft. So, P.S., when you leave and you go back to sit with the ministry that handles transport, public transport, please also relay. I know I will be speaking to the minister.
Noted.
And that has been in the minister's presentation for the last number of years, that they're going to a cashless system. And again, it comes right back to policy and the resources given to ensure that it happens. I just want to go to page 11, Dr. Henry. And I think it's a conversation, a policy response, and a diversification of the Jamaican economy, because we keep speaking about it, but I think with COVID, it shows how, I don't want to use the word fickle, but how it is that just having the bulk of our economy depending on mining and services, in this instance, the tourism sector, that if we have a shock, how that shock would impact the economy. And I know it comes right back down to policy again, but from where you sit, you have it here in your report. What are the avenues that we're looking at? And I don't know that agriculture is one that area that we're looking at as part of that diversification. But what other area is it? I know the member Jackson had mentioned about the quality of the BPO sector and the various areas that we can strengthen it. But is this an area between yourself and the FS that we're really taking a serious look at? Because when I look at when COVID came upon us and the closing down of the tourism sector itself, it did not impact our revenues that great, but it impacted the employment. And it shows also the contribution that it makes to our revenues. And yes, it did impact our employment significantly, but it shows us that we have to look at different other avenues in shoring up the economy. So again, I ask the question again, you know, is there anything that you can add to that area?
So thank you for that, Chairman. So as you make reference to the need for greater diversification, and you spoke to my PIOJ, Ministry of Finance, a lot of the initiative, I would say, policy direction over the last number of years in terms of entrenching macroeconomic stability, in terms of debt reduction, increasing fiscal resilience as a country, we'd argue helps to create a framework that enables what we call an enabling environment for the greater diversification. So yes, you speak to the need for, and it would speak to one aspect is a policy direction, but particularly in an environment where you remove anomalies that would have come through incentive regimes, etc. You look for an environment that allows players, stakeholders, to pursue various avenues. So somebody who's creative, you know, if there is greater access to finance, if there's greater efficiency in whether, you know, trading across borders, opening a business, all of the improvements, a number of the initiatives we've seen over the last number of years would support efforts towards greater diversification. So as you speak of, as against years ago, you've seen some structural shifting in our economy, as with others globally, towards greater services. But then you're seeing the BPO sector being a feature that was not several years ago. You're seeing in some aspects greater levels of the creative industry coming forward, and the need to put in place the mechanisms to facilitate. You know, we speak of the film policy, we speak of how we engage in greater ways, formality to the entertainment sector. So a number of things we are seeing. So I would argue, or I would respond, member, that you've seen some things that persons, you know, we had a discussion not long ago that says it's not that graduates now are any more creative, entrepreneurial, let's say it that way, but the context in which they emerge as they graduate is a more facilitatory one for starting a business. You know, you see those features of many MSMEs emerging, and as you do a trend, you see more coming to the fore, and for a number of reasons, but one of which issues like access to finance, a more facilitatory tax structure, some of the things that you have seen over the years being specifically treated with. Do we have a ways to go? Sure. We need to do much more, as Governor spoke about. We've seen fluctuations in competitiveness and other issues, but over in a trend line, we are seeing some of the right initiatives, we think, to better enable a context where you have a lot of new and emerging industries to appear.
We're seeing where the FDI is really still, the bulk of it is still within the tourism sector. And I said, you know, the COVID opened up a lot of thinking for us as a country, and the impact on the servicing and the mining. I mean, with Jamaica, with the explosion, down, and tourism down, then, you know, so where I would want us to think or to start looking, what are the other areas that we're going to put that planning in and that you know, thought in? Is it going to be agriculture? Is it going to be crops for export outside of what we use for domestic market? But I'm not seeing that sort of concentration on, because COVID is still fresh. You know, where are we moving on? And I understand your reasoning on the BPO and the opening up of dealing with the tax structures and everything, but we're still seeing a large portion of the FDI in tourism and not in other areas. So how is it then that, with be it policy or any other you know, influence in how we can now bring into you know, the dealing with byproducts? We have been speaking about the the nearshore port operations for a long time, for light manufacturing. Where are we in those areas that will influence the economy, that we are not as dependent on those two sectors, and that bringing that diversification that we generally speak about in layman terms?
Sure. Thank you, Member. So we have seen some policy initiatives around, and you've heard articulated quite a bit, the initiatives to strengthen linkages with the tourism sector and the domestic economy. And so as assessments have been done, the road to sustained growth, as a publication with the help of some of our development partners, as we've done assessments in improving Jamaica's resilience, etc. The studies have shown, among a number of things, that the agricultural sector, as you've mentioned, is a key sector, and that characterizes employment, livelihoods for a large proportion of our population, whether directly or indirectly. And so the need then to make endemic the benefits of an economy that accrue to agriculture, for example, and so the hence for greater linkages. And you've heard in terms of not just agriculture in its true sense, but in terms of, when you speak of agro-processing initiatives to improve, whether through the Hounslow initiative, where we do the pepper mash facility, public-private partnership, incorporating the private sector in a more meaningful way, what we're seeing in the poultry industry. So we are seeing some initiatives, and I think quite a bit, Minister, but for me to say, I would again suggest, as I did for a more fulsome response, and to allow us to collate and to trend line and tell you where a better assessment, situation analysis of where we are, just to have that kind of a discussion with various players, including ourselves.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Henry, in your presentation earlier on, you had mentioned about the decline in the construction sector. Could you elaborate more on that, because it was a bit surprising to me when you mentioned that?
While it may warrant a greater deep dive, we've seen one for the sector increases in input costs in terms of cost of material, and it's something we discussed sometime before, that a lot of what takes place in the industry are seeing a lot of a degree of import dependence. And so as you see import dependency of the industry, that a lot of our inputs, raw materials, somebody some time ago, with all that we were seeing in construction, why didn't we see that greater throughput in terms of growth to the overall economy? I would say the construction industry very, very in some cases labor, in terms of a lot of employment generated in the sector, but a lot of our materials, unfortunately, in terms of for building residential and non-residential, we saw coming in from abroad. And so some of those same materials you're seeing in the inflationary environment, a lot of those costs have gone up, while we saw have increased. And so most costs are right across the board, as you can imagine, with inflation at the levels it has been globally, and the response of authorities to treat with it, that right across for the large degree of jurisdictions, we've seen increases because of as we've said, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, because of the supply chain disruptions, because of COVID. So a number of initiatives there, because of the labor demand, as we recover, particularly in some of the larger economies, what we've seen in terms of inflationary impulse there. So we've seen prices going up, and that would have affected to a large degree the construction industry in great degree. Part of what we saw, some initial, what would have seemed to be those continued activity. You remember when we had the COVID and we were seeing the construction sector growth continuing and activity continuing, and part of that would be the relatively inelastic characteristic of projects, that things that you get started, it would take some time before it's affected by the current environment, including as interest rates would increase, you would see some activities continue because you've already locked in financing for what you've started, and once things are, your ground is broken, etc., activities start, and so you may find some lag in terms of timing between some of what you're seeing in even the monetary sector. So part of the challenge would be some of those projects that you'd have seen, some medium-term 2 to 3 year projects, would begin to close, and so you would see some of that effect coming in. So it would, of course, warrant a deeper dive to really disaggregate and say exactly what factors. But again, it's multifaceted. I like that word more than complex, but it just says there are different factors at play. Thank you.
Just on the revenue side, the tax revenue, FS, the PAYE, and can you just remind me, though, Dr. Reed, before the FS, the categories of where we're seeing more workers entering the workforce? Which areas? Yeah.
I'll be doctor. It's quite fine. And so we are seeing in the BPO sector, we saw a pickup in employment there, and we saw in the accommodation sector, we saw a pickup there also in terms of some of the numbers picking up. And in other services, entertainment, you would see some activities there. Part of the challenge is some of that industry is off radar or just informal. We're not as easily tracked. Some of the policy response to COVID has helped in terms of strengthening registration and people coming on the map to access benefits. So we're seeing a little more, getting more information there.
All right. Well, it comes back to my question because there's even though small in relative terms, Madam FS, an increase in the PAYE intake. What areas of employment would that? Are you seeing that?
Okay, so I could not give you that detail, sir.
Is it something that you could break out for us at some point? I mean, I don't have to get it today.
Right. I'd have to check with TAJ as to whether they can generate it at that level.
Yeah, and that's why I asked, because in these areas that the uptick, in some instances are informal, in sense of the entertainment and things. So seeing that you're having an increase in the PAYE, and we haven't really seen that dramatic salary increases yet coming from central government, it would be interesting to see where this is coming from. The reduction in the SCT that's mainly from the liquor, seeing that there's been complaints of less and less white rum and Appleton on the shelves. This is coming from production and consumption.
All right, so for the April to July period, what you have is a reduction in the SCT on the domestic side, but on the international trade side.
Yes, it's the domestic side that domestic side. I was trying to figure out, because this would be more the manufacturing sector.
Right, so the bulk of the SCT would be coming from the oil.
Okay.
It comes from the fuels. So really, it moves between the international trade and the domestic production.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, the people in the construction sector, one of the complaints they have made is the duties that are charged on the CIF values of the import component in the construction industry. And in fact, the government took a windfall, because when you have the big rise in freight charge, when a container used to be $2,500, $3,000, and it go to $25,000, the CIF costs of those imports go up, and by extension, the duty is on the CIF. The government gets a windfall. There's a trend down now in the whole logistics sphere. Are you contemplating a reduction in your revenues as a result of those changes?
I'm not sure how much that would have been contributing to our overall revenues. Certainly what we have indicated is an increase in the revenues.
Increase.
We have seen for the period gone, that has already gone an increase, and we are expecting an increase in the overall revenues.
Yeah,
I
so
don't think that would result in any reduction or much of a reduction.
All right, any other questions? Just to close, Madam FS, compensation review.
Yes, sir. What about it?
Any updates on it, where by when we expect that we...
All right, so the discussions have continued. I'm aware that there has been some information in the public space from the union yesterday. We believe we are fairly close. We do need them to officially speak with us before we are able to make an announcement, but we are basically there in terms of moving towards the activity that needs to take place to implement.
Yes, please. I heard that your answer to the chairman. You heard it in the press, and really, you're not going to make any pronouncements.
Saying that I am aware that the union said something. I am not saying that. What I am saying is based on what the union said in the press.
And I see the smile on your face. That means that you're very welcoming of that news that you got in the press. If what the press reports is correct, could you make any projections? Of course, condition on that being so.
All right, I believe we're on record as indicating that we need a couple months to do the actual implementation once we have an agreement on what is being implemented, because this is not a simple increase, it's an overall restructure, it's a total change of the compensation structure of the public sector. We have some guidelines that need to be changed. We have all of the new information that will need to be filtered to across the relevant public service. We have to do a supplementary that moves the money from finance into all of the ministries and departments before we can get to a point where we can make the payment.
After the sign-off with the unions, what period of time would you need to implement it? 2 months?
At least 2 months.
Okay.
We will be working as fast as we can, but I would say we need
at a minimum 2 months. Can be more, but a minimum 2 months.
It could be more.
Contentious issues we heard was the duty concession for public sector workers. Have that been settled?
All right,
in terms of how it will be treated?
I would not be able to speak to any details at this point, sir.
Well, you know, it doesn't, nothing wrong with trying though, FS.
Member, are you negotiating your salary in the PBCJ? You're paid by the Ministry of Finance. All right.
If I can, Chairman, I'm being reminded that on the issue of diversification and the question as we spoke,
yes,
that from a strategic standpoint, JAMPA has indicated their own targeting on some specific sectors: global digital services, logistics, infrastructure, film, animation. There's some key areas, agribusiness processing, of course. So as you speak to the need, it's an overall thrust to greater diversified economy.
All right, thank you. I think it's an area that we need to keep the conversation going. As I said, COVID was a wake-up call for us, and the bulk of our employment, or I said the sector itself, when you look at the tourism sector, did not affect the revenues that greatly compared to others, and same with the mining. It is more, I said that once, to see the growth that we're getting and seeing the standard of living rise, we will need some more other sectors that are goods producing sectors to really lift the standard of the economy itself. So I think it is time that we have that conversation and moving forward in that direction, hence my question to you. All right, members, are there any other?
No other, but I just feel obliged, Chairman, to just put on the records. I had, as you will recall, and the records would have reflected on the meeting of the 4th of May, when I had posed some question to the BOJ, and for which I complained strenuously about the lack of response to those questions. That was tabled first in the Standing Finance Committee on January 11th, and subsequently on May 10th in the PAAC meeting, where I posed the question here and for which the answers were supposed to be sent to the committee as I placed the question here, that to date, those answers have not been provided to me as a member, to the committee, and to extent myself as a member of the committee. The BOJ has failed to respond as it had promised. It is to be understood that the BOJ answers to the Parliament. It answers to other places too, but one doesn't negate the other. And so it is my understanding that the answer to the question posed will be submitted to the committee as was requested in the last meeting and now being reminded of today.
I see the governor has not acknowledged. Yeah. All right, members, we have some housekeeping matters to deal with after, so I'll ask the members to remain. Let me thank the team that came here today, and I hope that it was at least, the conversations were fruitful. Thank you very much. All right, members, we need to go through item 5, which is confirmation of the minutes. The minutes were circulated. I'm sure I can take them as being read. Are there any amendments of the minutes? No corrections? So can I move for the adoption of the minutes? Member Jackson? Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying so move. I read through it.
Thank you very much, Member Hamilton. Any matters arising from the minutes?
I think we're supposed to get some information relating to the challenges of the PPVs to take up the COVID grants. I don't recall getting an update on that.
Right.
But I don't know if it makes sense now. I don't know where we are with the grants.
That is what we need to do, is really to write to the Minister of Finance, because I remember in that meeting we were told that the Ministry of Transport had no control over the approval or any aspect of the grants to the transport sector. So I'll ask the clerk to write to the Ministry of Finance, who is administering.
But I think the ministry had indicated that they would have written to the to finance to get the information.
Did.
Because it really touches and concerns that ministry.
Okay. And there's a second grant also that has been proposed and should have been disbursed already. So we'll ask on both of them. All right. No other matter arising. Members, on any other business, I just want to make note, members, that there are two issues that I want to touch on. One is that the clerk had sent out an email having to do with a response from members on the contract for Mr. Bartley. Only a handful of members have responded. So the contract for Mr. Bartley is still pending. So I'm going to ask members to, as soon as possible, to respond to that email. The second item is really our meetings. Last year we had 15 meetings over the fiscal year. So far we have only gone 4 meetings for this fiscal year. And the challenge that we're having is that when we send out emails to members, still again, only a handful of members. There are 15 members on the committee, 14 members, 14 members on the committee. And we are not being able to keep these meetings or to move forward if we don't get the majority of the members responding. The clerk of the House is holding us to the standing orders. As chairman, I can only direct the meetings, but I can't set meetings unless, or the clerk can't set meetings unless the members respond. We have some dates in mind. We have 2 reports with us, one from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and one from the Ministry of Education. We have had those reports for some time. They have been sent out electronically to members. I think the one for Labor has been given, hard copies have been given to us. We have days that are available, and members, one of the challenges that we're having, where a Wednesday was blocked out for the PAAC, that is no longer that's no longer, because what is happening is that joint select committees are also offered those dates. So when we block out, we generally block out the Wednesdays. If we don't have any dates, then we have to give it up. And then when we don't utilize them, then they are used. So I'm making a proposal before you go, member. November 2, 16th, and the 30th are available. The challenge is that November 2nd, the 16th, and the 30th. The challenge that we have, that some of the mornings are taken up by joint select committees. The risk that we run is that even though there is not a sitting assigned to that afternoon, the leader of government business can utilize it because it is a parliament day, and we may lose it on a Wednesday. Right? So where we can't get it on the Wednesday morning, we were looking at the Wednesday afternoon in some instances, because we have a lot of work. I understand it's a risk that we take, but
Chairman, we would have to check with the whip. Minister Grange has a listing of the various presentations, constituency debates, which will continue to occupy Wednesday afternoons. So could we just double check that listing and the dates for presentation? And I think at most, if somebody else decides, look, I want to present, it shouldn't take us more than a week off that schedule to see how best that could be our guide to pre-schedule and lock some dates in.
The debate is not even an issue, because from time to time you might find the government has a ZOSO or something, some matter that they want to bring. So it's just a risk. But the general point I want to make is that these dates here, these dates are mornings. These are morning dates.
I have one other question for you on it, and the two of us have sparred about trying to figure this out as it relates to committee meetings. Is there any possibility at all that we could have a discussion with the clerks to figure out if there is a way we can keep a meeting via Zoom, everything is recorded, and a time slot is generated to put together the notations, air it at another time on PBC, something that allows us to be able to have 2 meetings at the same time, even with Parliament as it is now, where we have limited space as we have it now and limited staff in a way. But is there any way we can meet elsewhere?
It's a greater issue. I have always said that part of the challenge that we have even though we're talking about meeting rooms and meeting times. I mean, you are on multiple committees. I know Member Hamilton is on probably about 8 or 10 committees yourself. The same. Yeah, you know, so it is, we are a small parliament compared to that in the UK that have hundreds of MPs. So we are a small parliament, it's a small backbench, much less a smaller opposition. You know? And when you look at the committees, remember, this is what, 14 members, there are only 3 opposition members on the committees. On other committees, there are only 2 opposition members. So it's a lot for even the backbenchers on the governing side. So it is not really just if we can do 2. And also, remember, the clerks, there's a shortage of clerks. So you find a clerk probably doing the job of the clerk for 3 or 4 committees. So, and some of them you can't, yeah. So staffing is also a problem. So, and you're talking about the stenographers also. So it is a bigger issue than just the Zoom or because I'm going to tell you, when we got here this morning, even though we had a few members online, the question was asked if this wasn't an important meeting, why we asked them to come out, and so few of us. At that time, it was just myself and Member Jackson that was here. So, you know, it is one. But members, the greater issue that I'm getting at is the members really, Member Jackson and Member Holness, the greater issue is that we are not able to set meeting dates unless we get the response from majority of the members. The question is even being asked of me by the media and other persons in our society. Why are we not keeping meetings? If we can't get a response from the members, the clerk cannot move forward in setting that date. So we are tardy as a committee also. Members are tardy. Right? So I'm just asking the members again. No, some, yeah. No.
Chairman,
yes.
What you just said is really an indictment. It's a major indictment. Because if it is that the committee secretary cannot get majority response to just agree on a time, if majority can't get to agree on a time, we're going to agree and have a meeting. Because to agree on something don't require you to be here. It just means to have an interest.
Yeah.
That's a major indictment. And especially for a committee like this.
And it is one,
Chairman,
it is the most significant
as
committee.
Well, in that regard, persons who are on more than one committee also have that issue of battling with time. What they need to do is make up their mind as to when other committees can be held. So if you notice, you no longer sit on CDF. I've taken a very different approach to utilizing the Parliament's time for CDF. That space is actually now available for other meetings, because the approach I took was to meet on days that are not heavy, particularly on a Tuesday, from 12 o'clock. So another committee meeting can be held first, and they hold to a tight time, and I literally do a pre-review and then do a tight 1 hour CDF meeting, so that we can increase the number of meetings on that day, and persons will be able to do both the Tuesday morning meeting and still stay for CDF meeting and be here for Parliament.
I think what needs to happen, and we have had, chairmen of committees have had meetings with the House Leader and the Speaker, because what is happening is also that those dates that would have been held for both PAC and PAAC, because of the load of the joint select committees, we have no more safety of dates. Yeah? So we have to go through and hold the dates. But I'm just saying that when we hold the dates, and members don't respond, we need 2 weeks to notify the agencies, our departments, our ministries. 2 weeks. So when we keep kicking the can down the road, just as is evident for this year so far, we have only had 4 meetings. 4. And by the time we go into next year, calendar year, going down to the end of the fiscal year, there are less meetings because you now have the budget debate. We had 15 meetings last year. We're down to 4. It's an indictment on us, and this is a committee that's entrenched, and we're really abusing it. So I'm just asking members again, because this is the umpteenth time, when we get the emails, please just respond, yes or no, because a date is generally put to it, right? And it is as bad that we have the consultant on a month-by-month contract because we have not responded. That is when we do get a date. But even when we get the date, a lot of members are now saying that are giving excuses. The last meeting we had quite a few excuses. There were only 3 of us inside here. You know, so members, and I tell you, it no look good. It no look good for a committee that at one time we had every member on the committee here, that when we ask technocrats to leave their offices, we sometimes complain that we're asking fool questions of the technocrats and wasting their time. When we invite them here, we have a responsibility to be here. Be it online that we provide for the online now, but we need to be here. There's also a schedule that we need to sign off on, and we have not really signed off on it.
Mr. Chairman, why I said it is an indictment, frankly, for my many years here, is the worst I've seen it. Committees are staffed by backbenchers, not ministers. In fact, ministers ought not to be on parliamentary committee except for joint selects. So there is no excuse. All members ought to be here, and the reason why they are not here are even responding to the Secretary's request for response, obviously because there's no interest.
All right.
And that is a matter of record.
It is.
Not an opinion.
Members, we have November 2nd, which we are proposing to bring the Ministry of Labour. We have November 16th, which we are proposing to bring the Ministry of Education, because we do have those two reports. We have a revised schedule in front of us. We have Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Housing Urban Renewal, estimated annual national and parish by parish housing output, looking at housing. And since it has been a topical issue, members, I'm proposing that we invite the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation to the meeting on November 30th. Members?
Just for the record, I'll tell you one of my observations. There are some ministries that come to PAC so often that I wonder when the permanent secretary finds any time to do work. I think that is something we should also look at. When we are looking at our diary for the year, if we can plan for the year, we find a way that we also target ministries, agencies, and departments that are not necessarily coming in front of us. So we see that they are on track in that year, and those that come to us on a frequent basis and usually give us good and stellar reports that we do not, I won't say penalize, because we're not really penalizing them. It's just that we want information. But we find a way to be more efficient with having them come and give us a detailed rundown of what they're doing, where they're at, so that we do not have to have them on a repetitive basis.
Well, let me just say this, that the Ministry of Economic Growth is one that has multiple ministries in it. But secondly, this suggestion has been asked of members more than once. We have been sitting on this revised. Right? Well, the truth be told is that the suggestion has been made by the consultant. I mean, we have been going over this from the start of the fiscal year, in going over this revise, right? But I am, since we have to exit the room, November 30th, looking at housing, we are going to ask Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, looking at housing, urban renewal. So we are going to sign off on the 2nd for Ministry of Labor, Social Security.
No, Chairman, you can't say that. You have to vote.
No, I'm putting it to the committee.
You said we are going to sign off. Chairman, even though they are cleaning up, Chairman, still important. This one thing I'm asking you. We discussed this, myself and yourself, and I've actually also discussed with some members, and there were persons who had issues just with the areas and the selection and what we were going to discuss. So outside of Parliament, can we just meet and just have a discussion? Because we really need to have this agenda going forward.
Is that none of these have been suggested by me.
I know.
They have been suggested by the consultant.
That was the point.
And it is for us to sign off on it. Right?
Mr. Chairman.
So
it is because we must congratulate the coordinator. It's because of our failure as a committee that he has to try to help us out. So we should be ashamed that we can't decide amongst ourselves and we end up doing nothing.
So that's not the issue that we can't decide among ourselves.
Member wholeness, we will sit and go through the remainder of it, right? But I am putting to the committee November 2nd for Ministry of Labor and Social Security, November 16th for the Ministry of Education, and November 30th for Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, dealing with housing, urban renewal. Can I get the committee to Member Holness and Jackson? You are voting for it. Thank you. Can I get the rest of Member Jackson? Thank you very much. Sure. And the other members.
Call my name.
Member Holness, I did. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much, Member Hamilton.
That's okay, on the 30th, Chair, but not the 16th.
Go again, sorry. Go again.
I'm in agreement with the 2nd and the 30th, but not the 16th. I just want to put that on record.
Okay. Well, let me just put it this way: that the 2nd is not a given because we're only giving 1 week to the ministry. Normally it is 2 weeks. So I'm trying to just maximize before the Christmas break those 3 dates. We have the 16th booked for the PAAC. Otherwise, there are no other dates until next calendar year. So we're holding those. We have an agreement on those 3 dates.
I'm registering for the clerk. On the 16th, I will be overseas on.
Not a problem. We have 14 members in the committee. If 2 are absent, I expect the rest to. Yes, Madam Lee.
Right, I'm saying I'm in agreement, and myself, I will be absent next week, Wednesday, as well, as I'll be on official duties overseas.
Not a problem.
Chair, may I?
Chairman, I'm in agreement with the date you put out.
Okay.
Chairman, I must tell you, I didn't realize. Chairman, I must tell you, I didn't realize that there were so many members online because I didn't come in on time. So now I noticed I wasn't feeling a little well this morning, Chairman. So Philip Henriquez, Tova Hamilton is online, Crystal Lee is online as members, and Dwight Silbies was online. I'm just going to ask everybody to come back together and just confirm that we do have enough numbers online to vote for the 16th, even if myself and Member Hamilton cannot make it for that date.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, sir, this is very uncomfortable. I've never seen for all my years where we went vote for a date. The size of the committee should allow for absence where members have other obligation to meet. So once we agree on some date, the rest of us are supposed to be here. And who can't be here because they're sick or they have official duties. But it's not a matter of voting for dates.
Member, you missed the point, Member Jackson. That's not the issue. The chairman said we need a majority, and the point I'm making, sir, is that we have enough persons online for us to make that majority decision right here. Yes. That's the point. So you went lost again.
So, Member Jackson and Holness, so the dates of November 2nd, 16th, and 30th. Thank you, members.
Chair, I only wanted to say one thing, Chair.
Yes.
What has borne out here with members who are apologizing because they have legitimate government business, it's just a call for us to, maybe as a parliament, coordinate. But I am not going to submit to the view that members who are absent, yes, we can do better in terms of responding. You raise a very valid point. But in terms of the number of joint select committees, members who sit on even 10 committees, members who are traveling on government business, we ought to be very careful that we do not give the impression that there are members here who are careless and who are not interested in the business of Parliament. But I do take your point here. Improvement is needed in that regard.
Thank you, Member. Date of the next meeting, members, would be November 2nd, 2022 at 10 a.m., which we are going to be inviting the Ministry of Labour, Social Security to that meeting. I move for the adjournment.
So move.
Thank you very much, members.
Jamaica, I can help you protect our citizens.
Jamaica Eye will play a part in increasing your public safety.
Jamaica Eye is part of an island-wide network of camera surveillance systems designed to increase the safety of you, our citizens. If you have a camera system outside your home or office facing a public space, log on to jamaicai.gov.jm today. Jamaica Eye, we're all connected. The Ministry of National Security, creating a safer and prosperous Jamaica.
My job is to ensure that every man, woman, and child maintain good health at all times.
Our primary function is to ensure that government services are delivered effectively and efficiently.
We are building forward
together.
Hello students, thank you for joining me for another fun and exciting language arts lesson. I'm your teacher, Mr. Jackson, and today we will be doing several practice activities to help us to prepare for the ability test. Be sure to have your pencils, notebooks, and brains ready as we dive into this lesson. Now, the ability test will have several types of questions testing our verbal reasoning skills, but today we will focus on one type of question. Analogy. So we know that we'll be doing activities that relate to the analogy questions, but how will we know that we are successful? We will know that we are successful when we can honestly do the following things. You should be able to say yes honestly to these I can statements. Number one, I can correctly define the term analogy. Number two, I can correctly complete given analogies. Number three, I can identify the relationship between analogy word pairs. Number four, I can make bridge sentences to interpret analogy word pairs. And number five, I can participate in this lesson from beginning to end. To begin, we first need to know what an analogy is. So, what is an analogy? That's right. An analogy is an extended comparison between two unlike things. There are different types of analogy questions on the ability test. These include synonyms, antonyms, parts to whole, steps in a process, things and their function, item category or item to category, implied relation